All right. Hello, everybody. And welcome to the second session of today, on the second day of Heisenbug. Heisenbug, that's got to be the coolest name for a conference ever, right? I mean, usually they are called this conference and that conference. Heisenbug, that is a really catchy name. Yeah, so very glad to be here. First time that I'm in St. Petersburg. I've been to other cities in Russia, but never to St. Petersburg. So great to be here. And I will be talking about why the biggest challenge with working with Selenium on an enterprise level, but you can take the enterprise actually out of it. It really doesn't matter that much. It's just that some issues become a little bit more apparent when you're working on an enterprise level. Anyway, why the biggest challenge is actually not Selenium itself, but there's a lot of other things that, if they are done right, then Selenium is not an issue at all. Yeah? So I'm going to try and shed some light on that. I will ask you a lot of questions. So this is not a session where you just lean back and download me talking. I will be especially asking the people in the back who thought they could escape. No, you can't. Yeah. All right. So we have an hour. Maybe we won't need the entire hour. If we need more, I'm also here afterwards. So just come and approach me, and we can take that offline. So. Yeah, my name is Michael. I am the co-founder of a company called Element 34 Solutions. Element 34, anybody an idea why we called the company Element 34 and not 33 or 35? Selenium, exactly. So you were good in chemistry, I wasn't. But selenium is the 34th element in the periodic system, in that table that you have to learn when you're in school. So selenium is the 34th element. So it seems that we have a little bit of a connection to selenium, and it's less the metal, but more the tool around it. And the reason why that is so is because we actually, so people in our company co-created parts of selenium. Yeah? So anybody who has worked with Selenium Grid, for example, Selenium Grid was developed by a gentleman called François Renaud. Him and I, we used to work for eBay a long time ago, and during that time, we developed Selenium Grid and open sourced it. Right? So if you're using Selenium Grid, that's coming from folks in our company. Same thing, Selendroid. Anybody has heard about Selendroid? Yeah. So Selendroid isn't coming from a member of our company, but same thing. A gentleman, Dominic Dari, he used to work on my team at eBay, and he, while we were working together, he developed Selendroid, which then became Appium, or became a pillar of Appium at some point. So. Point is, we don't have a 20-year company history, but we're very close to the Selenium ecosystem. And that's why I want to share some things that I'm seeing and that we are seeing when we're out there with our clients. I want to pass on some experience, some know-how, so that you don't have to make the same mistake that other people do. I'm also here to learn from you, right? That's why I'm going to ask you a lot of questions. So I don't just go to conferences to provide knowledge. I'm also equally trying to see what's going on out there in the industry, right? And what better place than here? So a quick poll. Just raise your hands. Who has never used Selenium? Okay, so 10%. It's not a shame. It's perfectly okay, right? That's why you're here, I'm assuming, because you want to find out more about it. Okay, so who has used Selenium for less than +- 2 years? Okay, so most of you, if I see that right. Good. Who uses, so I'm assuming everybody else has used it for longer than 5 years. Who uses Java to write your tests? Okay, or checks, depending on, I have to be careful with the tests, checks. So yeah, maybe a little disclaimer. If I say test, that's the same thing as check. So I'm not going to get into that whole topic, so just replace one with the other. Okay, so Java and then JavaScript. Okay, it's interesting. Because one thing that I'm seeing, and I'm not saying that's a good or bad thing, but one thing that I'm seeing is that more and more companies are using JavaScript to also write the UI automation with Selenium, right? So that in this room, at least, that hasn't seemed to caught on yet. And again, I'm not saying that's necessarily a good thing. So who is a developer? Okay. So 2, 3. Everybody else a QA, engineer, QA, whatever. Yeah? QA, whatever. Okay. All right. So yeah, let's just call it QA engineer. Good. So that's the major part. And last question: who works in a larger enterprise setting, which I would say, more than 5,000 people in the company? Okay, so a few. And again, I think a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about surfaces more when you're working on an enterprise level. But please, you can apply all of that also one-to-one to a little startup. Yeah. Okay, so what I keep hearing about Selenium. So we, maybe just one more thing about the company, so that puts a little bit it into more context. So we do a little bit of consulting around Selenium, and we also have a product. It's called Selenium Box. It's like an on-premises Selenium grid infrastructure for enterprises. So we see the Selenium space really from the end user perspective, but also from the infrastructure perspective, right? So that's why I'm going to try and share both angles of this topic. So what I keep hearing when we go out there is we use Selenium because it's free. Yeah? Okay, it's kind of free. We're going to look into that if it really is free, or if it's as free as you may think. Well, this is a big one. Selenium doesn't work for us. Anybody would agree with it? No? Selenium works for everybody? Okay. We keep hearing from people, well, but it's also, there's always a political debate around tooling as well, right? So there's always a reason to find why a specific tool doesn't work, right? Of course. But we hear this quite a bit. And then when you start asking, well, what exactly doesn't work? Then we're like, the data and stuff like that. So we're going to talk about that later. You need to be able to code to use Selenium. Would you agree with that? Yeah? Anybody still using Selenium IDE? Okay. How is that working out for you? So? Sorry? More or less. Okay. All right. Well, Selenium IDE, just to mention that, it's deprecated, right? And I think as of Firefox 55, it's actually no longer supported. So I'm assuming you are trying to migrate over to the real Selenium, how I would call it. Okay, so yes, you need to be able to code, right? And this is a big thing, right? That you somewhat need to know what you're doing when you're writing your tests. Selenium tests are hard to maintain. This is a classic. Everybody says, in the beginning it's fairly easy. You can do it, right? And then as you add more and more to your test code base, it becomes harder and harder to maintain. And there's typically a handful of reasons for that. Yeah? And we're also going to look into that, how you can pretty easily avoid that. The maintenance nightmare, right? We have many clients out there who have millions of lines of code to write tests, and they don't even know what it does anymore, right? It's just, it has become a sport to write Selenium tests. But, you know, when you then look, I don't know who was in the talk by Michael Bolton last night, right? So there's a lot of tests floating around, and nobody really knows what they actually do. Yeah. But Selenium tests can be hard to maintain. Absolutely, they can. Selenium is flaky. This is a good one. So who thinks that Selenium or Selenium tests are flaky? Ha! Here we have about a third of the room. Yeah. And this is going to be actually one of the main topics I'm going to talk about. I'm going to feed off a presentation by a gentleman called Richard Bradshaw. I don't know if you've come across him. I'm going to take some inspiration from one of his talks and look at it from a different angle. But yes, so there's a lot of statements out there. Selenium is flaky. And again, when you then dig a bit deeper into it, then you may find that it's not Selenium that's flaky, but something else. Then the people who have given up on Selenium, right? So who in this room has looked into Selenium alternatives? Yeah? Found anything? No? Test Cafe? Yes. Yes, there's some others out there. I'm going to mention them without any, saying whether they're good or bad, or, I mean, there's no such thing as good or bad. But again, there are alternatives popping up. Some of them claim we don't use Selenium, that's why we're better, which may be the case. But again, it's worth it to have a close look before you just throw everything that you've done away with Selenium and just adopt that new shiny tool that's out there. Yeah, exactly. So our new tool doesn't use Selenium. So Selenium is no longer sexy to people, right? Because it's 10 years old. Yeah, well, it's not the shiny new kid on the block, right? It's been around for a while. All right, Selenium is slow, yes. It's not Selenium that's slow. It's just the fact that you're running UI tests, right? And they just tend to be slow. But of course, Selenium, to do a click takes a certain time. To load a page takes a certain time. Ramp-up effort is super high. Here I may say some stuff that will make me unpopular, so I apologize in advance. That applies in general to the talk. So yes, people find it hard to ramp up on Selenium, right? And again, the question is it hard to ramp up on Selenium, or is it hard to ramp up on coding if you don't have a coding background, maybe? Then there was a small group of people last night in the Birds of a Feather session, which I participated in regarding frameworks, whether you should build your own framework or whether you should just take a framework that's already out there. And so what I keep hearing a lot is, okay, so we decided to work with Selenium. Now we have to put together a 5-person team and build a framework for the next 2 years. Yeah? That doesn't produce a lot of tests. So Selenium doesn't come with any test case management and reporting capabilities. That's true. And that's why a lot of enterprise organizations, they want this one-size-fits-all tool, and they want this tool that does the shiny reporting where they can enter their manual test cases, push the button, it converts it to some automated tests. And Selenium doesn't do that, and we'll see why that is. That's actually by design, that you don't have any shiny reporting mechanism behind it, or that you don't have any shiny test case management system that hooks, or that it provides. And then this one, I need to build and maintain a Selenium infrastructure. And this, what I mean by this is the browser infrastructure, the browsers where you run your tests. Who has a homegrown Selenium infrastructure or a Selenium grid? Okay, a few. Everybody else is running locally, or are you using some SaaS providers like, I don't know, Sauce Labs, Browser Stack? Yeah? Okay. Good. So there are, and we're going to talk about that as well, but this is the general notion that, well, I either go to a commercial provider that provides the infrastructure for me. Especially in enterprises, that's not always possible, right? So, and also depending if you're working in a bank. If anybody works in a bank, I'm pretty sure you're not using any, outside Selenium infrastructure, right? So this can be very consuming and actually killing the entire Selenium effort. Because you have to put a lot of work into it, and if you don't, then you get those flaky tests, right? Or one of the reasons is why you get those flaky tests. Okay, so anybody wants to add anything to this list? I mean, I'm sure we can fill the entire hour just by adding on to this list, but I'd like to hear if somebody has a thought on this. No? Okay. Good. I'm sure if you think about it, there's lots more reasons to find what you could say about Selenium. So everybody was in the opening keynote by Simon yesterday. I wasn't there. I was on the plane at that time, but I'm sure he mentioned something like this: Selenium automates browsers. That's it. If you look on the Selenium website, that's one of the first things that you will see. Selenium automates browsers. And I would say all that Selenium is, and I just got this reconfirmed by Simon himself. So I see Selenium as a library to interact with browsers and the underlying DOM. Period. Nothing else. Yeah? And Selenium is a standard, or in bracket, is becoming a standard. Yeah, I'm sure Simon has spoken about that too, the W3C standardization. And everything else, what you do with it is pretty much up to you, right? And that's exactly where a lot of these topics, these arguments come in, why Selenium works this way, or why Selenium doesn't work a certain way, right? So Selenium itself, if you just take the browser, if you say click here, send keys there, whatever, find an element, it typically does that. And it does that very, very well. It's usually the stuff around it that isn't exactly perfect, and that's where there are certain things that you can try and prevent, so that that you don't see all those issues. So that said, this is very important, and I think this definitely warrants a quick round of applause, especially for Simon and David Burns, who have worked on the W3C standardization for, I think, 5 years, was that? Yeah. So this is fantastic news. It's in the proposed recommendation stage, which means it's pretty much a standard, right? I think that's one level away, right? So this also means that Selenium is not something that's just going to go away because it's no longer so sexy, right? It's Simon said last night too, HTTP may not be super sexy either, and it may not do everything that you want it to do, but it works quite well, right? And so does Selenium. So Selenium is pretty much a standard, and if you see, like, everything is somewhat based on that standard. Even those new tools that we're going to talk about are somewhat hooking into that standard. Now, that and the good old test pyramid. Where is Selenium in here? Here, 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 somewhere up there. The UI. Yeah, exactly. That's where Selenium is. And nowhere else. That's all you can do with Selenium. I keep hearing this term, oh, we write unit tests with Selenium. That always confuses the hell out of me. Like, what does that mean? We write unit tests with Selenium. What people typically mean is that we use JUnit to write our Selenium tests. So we use JUnit as a test framework to drive the tests. But that's not a unit test, of course. No? Good. So in everything that we do with Selenium, we always have to keep in mind we are exercising the UI of an application. That's it. All right, so now let's look for some answers to those points that I raised before. So we use Selenium because it is free. Simple answer to that, don't. Do not use Selenium just because it's free. I get a lot of this, oh, you know, we're moving off our HP stack and we want to save money in the tooling, and that's why we use Selenium. That's the worst idea ever, right? Because Selenium is, yes, you don't pay license fees for it. That's correct. But we do Selenium trainings with our company, right? And so there's usually when, you know, to open the session, we ask people, you know, why did you decide to use Selenium? And then 80% of the people say, oh, because it's free. I'm like, no, it's not free, because I'm not free. I'm standing here, not here, right here in St. Petersburg, but I'm standing here, or one of our employees stands here, gives you the training, right? That's not free. So your company has paid us that you can attend this training. You also are taking 2 days out of your work schedule, right? And are not producing what you're supposed to produce. So you're in training, right? So that's a pretty good indicator that Selenium's not free. And then there's many other reasons why Selenium is not free. And one of the things is also because you have to hire, I think, a very different type of person to work with Selenium, compared to if they worked with some big vendor-supported tool set, right? Because Selenium does not have a 1-800 number, or I don't know what it's in Russia, you know, these toll-free numbers. It doesn't exist. So if you have a problem, you have to search for the solution yourself, right? You have to maybe read the code. You can't just call up anybody and say, hey, I'm filing a ticket, right? And then at some point you hear back maybe from the vendor and says, oh, you know, we need more information about that, and then the ping pong game starts, right? So, and those people who work in that different mode, in my experience, tend to be a little bit more expensive on the market than the person who you know, is just like, oh, I'm just going to use this tool and I'm just going to file the ticket if I have a problem with it. So, point is, Selenium is not free when you use it. You need to be able to code to use Selenium. Yes, I think you already agreed with that. Yes, you do. There's absolutely no question about that. And this is one of the biggest problems, I believe, because a lot of testers, or QA engineers, whatever you want to call them, at least in the regions where we have our clients, they are not developers. They don't have a coding background. So what their manager oftentimes says is, okay, so we're moving to automation. Why don't you go attend the Selenium training, and then after that you're done. You're good to go. So I'm expecting you to write perfect code after that. And that just unfortunately doesn't work like that, right? Because in the end, so one of the things that when we do the trainings, for example, the opening slide is typically test automation is software development. That's the opening slide. Right? So what you're doing, you're writing software. It just happens to test something or to check something. Yeah? But in the end, you still have to think about architecture. You still have to keep refactoring your code. It's not something that you just write once and then it's done. Right? And that's unfortunately oftentimes the belief that people have, right? Especially management, they think, oh, we're just going to retrain anybody to be an automation person, right? And then they can go away and code, right? And we also see this. So people, when they come to our trainings, for example, when we ask them, so what's your expectation? Then they say, oh, I want to learn Selenium. The fact is, about half of the training has nothing to do with Selenium. It's about questions, what do I want to automate? What can I automate? On which level do I automate? Do I actually need to automate everything with Selenium just because I can? Probably not, right? You should have actually as few Selenium tests as possible. Right? Here we have Mr. JUnit in the front right here. So that's the level you should have most of your automated tests. Yeah? Not with Selenium. Selenium, you should only do the stuff that nothing else can do. Yeah? Yeah? And I said before, a lot of companies, when we go in, they are very proud of the fact that they have 10,000 Selenium tests, but no unit tests. So that's a bit of a difficult position to start off from. Yeah? So yes, you have to be able to code in order to work with Selenium. And also the ramp-up effort is not super high. I would say the ramp-up effort is not high if you're a developer, right? Or if you have a development background. That doesn't mean that you have to have developer written on your business card. It just means that if you have a development background, using Selenium is actually a piece of cake, right? Because it perfectly fits into your development environment, right? In the end, it's just a library that you pull in as a dependency into your project, and that's it, right? And then you can use it. So there's not really that much to ramp up on. Of course, you need to know how to test. There's no question about that. So you have to have that testing mindset and testing spirit. And I'm not saying that every developer is good at that, right? I mean, there's a reason why some people see themselves more on the testing side, others see themselves more on the development side. But I think also with agility and DevOps and all those buzzwords, the expectation is that testing moves closer to the developer, right? And again, that does not mean that the QA's job will go away. I think it just frees them up to do meaningful things, right? For the people who cannot code. Yeah. So point is, I think it's a very bad idea to try to convert somebody who has zero background in programming to an automation engineer. Very bad idea. Selenium tests are hard to maintain, and I'm just going to have a very simple example. And there's many, many things wrong in this example. All right, so this is a very simple test. It's actually not even a test because it doesn't have an assert. Yeah? So this test will always be green unless it fails for some other reason. Yeah? So what's wrong with this? Everything. Pretty much. There is no weight. Well, maybe I don't need a weight. That. Okay. Yeah, maybe just hand around the microphone.
Actually, I don't think I need a microphone, but still, I think it's not quite readable. It's not structured. It's not very good test from test perspective. I think, from my point of view. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah. So there's pretty much every line there's something wrong, and.
I think
yeah.
I think it's about class name. It's not stable.
Yeah.
More options? Oh, we have a lot.
Yep.
Who was here? Okay.
We should put quit in finally or after.
Yep.
Driver implemented in the test, not in another class, and hard-coded link, hard-coded string, which we find. And
is it enough?
There's one gentleman behind you.
One more.
I think just at the bottom we should have some kind of assert, so we should expect something from that test. Yeah. That's my idea. Yeah.
All right, so thank you for totally destroying my piece of code. No, but that's exactly it, right? And honestly, this is so common to find tests, or tests in quotation like that, right? So, you know, here we have no way to select different browsers because it's hard-coded to a Chrome driver that will pop up a local Chrome on your machine, right? You have no way to send that somewhere else. Everything is hard-coded. You know, you have the find element by class name. You have that in your test. That's something that you can put into a page object, for example, or into you know, somewhere else. That has nothing about your locator should be in the test. And of course, if you write your tests like this, it's going to be incredibly difficult to maintain them, right? Because every time that locator changes, you will have to go into your code and change everything, right? And of course, you know, you can say, yeah, but I can search and replace in my IDE. Yes, you can, but it opens the door for problems or for wrong refactorings. Yeah. So, just as a very simple example. Now this one. This is my favorite one. Selenium tests are flaky. I totally stole this from Richard Bradshaw because he says, no, it's not your Selenium tests, it's you are flaky, right? And this is one of the talks that I would highly recommend to watch. It's half an hour. It's from last year's Selenium conference in Berlin. And it's fantastic. He pretty much nails every nail on he hits every nail on the head, right? Because he actually goes through it and dissects why it's not Selenium that is flaky. It's a lot of things around it, right? And so I'm just going to try to compress his 30 minutes in 2 or 3. Right, and just go through a few things through his key points. So what can make a test flaky? And a flaky test in my world is, I don't know how it's going to behave. It can be red, it can be green, it can be, I don't know, it stops in the middle. Right, so it's an undeterministic behavior. Right? What can cause that in the context of Selenium? What's your internet problems, for example, right? JavaScript. Mm-hmm. Third party. Yes. Hmm? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Frequent updates of browsers, exactly. Mm-hmm. Anything else? What about test data? Test data, if you, everything you said, absolutely, right? Those can be triggers for flakiness. One of the biggest cause for flakiness that I've experienced is the inability to manage, create, and destroy test data, right? So we work with a lot of large enterprises, and because we're based in Switzerland, there's a lot of banks and insurances out there, right? And what we're seeing is that a lot of them, they just, go out, they take production data, copy it, deploy it into their test system, and then they consume it, right? But they don't refresh that test data over, 4, 6 weeks, sometimes 6 months. So they have no way to create data on demand. And that's a huge problem, right? Or they also don't, so a lot of the times test data collides, right? So one test does something with test data, and another test does something else with the same data set. Right? And then, of course, you have that flakiness. Right? And sometimes it passes, sometimes it fails, and nobody knows why. Another good one that I keep seeing is, oh, well, we can't run more than 5 tests in parallel against our test instances because they're not properly equipped with CPU and resources. Right? So if you fire up your CI, you push in 200 tests at the same time, your test system just gives up, right? And then sometimes it may actually work, and sometimes it won't work, right? And that creates the flakiness. Now, what people have started doing, and also there's vendors so tool vendors out there, they're trying to cover up that flakiness. Yeah, and I think Michael Bolton also went into that a little bit last night. So, you know, simple one is you just keep retrying that test until it's green. Okay. Well, if the purpose is to get the test green, then yeah, that may be a good strategy, but it's probably not, right? So you just keep trying to run the test until it says, oh, okay, now I actually managed to get everything done and I'm green. People never investigate the real reason why a test is flaky, right? And so now, you know, now there's also a lot of these reporting frameworks that you can plug into your tests. And but they just tell you which test is flaky, which is great, right? But then still what you need to do is dig in and find out what exactly happened there, right? Don't just say, if I run it 5 times, 1 out of 5 times, it'll pass, so I'm good. You know? So don't cover up your flakiness. Tool choice. So we are seeing a lot of you know, depending if you're following Twitter a little bit, you know, there's always people who say, I have discovered this new tool like Test Cafe or Cypress or Puppeteer or whatever, you know, and we're moving away from that. We're moving away from Selenium to that. And I think what I'm seeing is there's a new tool for everything every week, right? So somebody comes up with a tool, open sources it, right? It's available on GitHub, creates a little bit of buzz around it, and then everybody thinks they need to move to that. So it's good to investigate, absolutely, right? And it's fun to evaluate tools. But what I'm seeing is new tool evaluations, how they happen is, first of all, it's the person who has the loudest voice in the team. They will push their tool of choice through. So it's typically not a good foundation how you evaluate your tools. It's like if I'm the loudest guy in the room and I say I like this, then that shouldn't be reason enough to keep going with that tool. And also, of course, the Hello World example on the README page of that GitHub project will always work. Of course it will, right? What you need to do is actually plug everything into your world and spend a little bit more time than just a Friday afternoon before you go home to evaluate that tool, right? So this needs to be a proper proof of concept where you say, okay, this new tool, I'm actually able to run that within my environment. And not just the Hello World and simple flows, but also a little bit more the edge cases. And then you will see if it really fits, right? And this is also something where I'm saying agility is great, but what I'm also seeing is a lot of agile teams, they are given simply too much power, right? Because I've seen it in some of the projects that we're in. One team had 3, so it was a 15-person team. They had 3 different front-end frameworks to develop their front-end. It's like, how does that happen? And that was exactly one of those cases where there were just really strong opinions by the people in the team. And, well, then you ended up with three frameworks, right? Not ideal. And now, of course, there's all these new tools out there that say we're better than Selenium or we're doing things different from Selenium. And I think that's also, by all means, check them out. You know, I'm not saying that there's nothing better than Selenium, but make sure it really, really fits the bill, right? And it fits the bill in terms of it doesn't just support one browser, right? Some of these tools out there, all they can do at the moment at least is support Chrome. Period. Well, if your clients only use Chrome, then that's fine, but probably not, right? They probably use other browsers as well. Are you able to run your tests in parallel, right? Does the underlying test engine or the test framework actually allow for parallelization of your tests? Right? Some of these new toolings that I've seen, they simply don't do that. And then also, a lot of them are only in one programming language. So the beauty of Selenium is that you have the choice between different programming languages, right? And it seems to be that in this room, at least, that is Java, right? Now, and but you can also do it in C#, in Ruby, in Python, in whatever you want. Of course, also in JavaScript. A lot of these new frameworks that are popping up only support JavaScript, which is not Java, right? A lot of people think, oh, well, it's same. No, it's not. It's very different. Yeah? So really, really think about why that new tool is actually better and if it's wise to move away from Selenium. And one thing that I just put that in this morning. So this is from a tool called Cypress. Anybody seen Cypress? Here we go. No more Selenium, lots more power. Now, what the hell does that even mean, right? And I don't know. I haven't used it, right? But this is stuff that I'm seeing out there. And if you show this, maybe some people are receptive to stuff like that, especially if you have these flaky tests, if you're caught up in maintenance hell, right? Then something like that, we're like, oh yeah, well, if I use that tool, then everything is going to be better. And I can guarantee you nothing's going to get better unless you fix all the other stuff, like the test data, the writing good code. Because here, you still have to write code. Yeah? All right, Selenium is slow. Well, that's just the nature of GUI level tests, right? So that's why you should have as few as possible. One thing that I'd like to put out there, Selenium has a pretty, good weighting mechanism, right? So, and thread sleep is not one of them. Yeah, so we see this the moment we go in, right? And there's the test is full of thread sleep, 30,000, right? Then you know that, well, first of all, it's probably flaky, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't have put in that thread sleep in the first place. But also that you're probably waiting way too long sometimes, and that will increase the runtime of your test. Yeah, so. I always see this when I do these Selenium trainings. People, people, even who have worked with Selenium for a couple of years, they're always like, "Oh, I didn't know there's an implicit and an explicit wait. I had no idea." Well, now you know. Test data. Yeah, so I already mentioned that probably one of the biggest causes of issues, and it doesn't matter what tool you're using, right? Whether that's Selenium, whether that's any of these other tools like Cypress or anything like that, or even Tosca, Ranorex, whatever's out there. It doesn't matter. If you can't control your test data, you're screwed, right? And this is, I think, one of the things I spent more than 10 years at eBay. And I joined in 2003, I think. And when I came there was already an API and a GUI interface to create test data. Any kind of test data you ever wanted, right? So you could create a user, you could create a credit card, anything you wanted, right? And I only appreciated that when I left eBay. And I realized, wow, what a luxury that was. Right? Because most companies, even 10 years later, have zero ability to actually, create and manage their test data. Right? So the only way they can do it is actually go to the production database, clone it, and then work with that. Yeah. So, not ideal by any means. Which also means when you are working with your developers. Right, if you're not the person developing the test on their own, the application directly, make sure that there's mechanisms to actually feed or to actually create test data in the application. That you provide APIs where you can say, okay, here I'm going to create a new user, or I'm going to create a new transaction, or whatever. Right? Testability of your application. I've spent, at least I feel like that, I've spent more time than anything else in my life trying to convince developers to put that freaking ID on the element. right? If it... I don't understand why that's such a big deal, right? If you don't do it, I mean, and this again, if a developer, or if there's no ID or way to identify an element, you have no chance with your automation, right? You have no chance. I've seen applications that upon page refresh, the ID changes. Every time you rebuild the application, the ID changes. I was like, how? There's no way, right? So that's what I call testability. And what I don't understand is why this is so hard and why it causes so many discussions around that when it's so easy to do. Yeah? So, if anybody wants to take this one into their companies, please do. Yeah? I've had partial success. So at eBay, after years, I actually managed to at least get part of the eBay application with IDs. Yeah. All right. Now this one, it's almost lunchtime, so just to whet your appetite a little bit. I need to build a framework before I can even use Selenium. No, you don't. It's fun to build a framework, and that was also the discussion last night in this BOF session, right? Building a framework is a lot of fun, but that's not typically what you get paid for. So I have a very clear stance on that. I say, of course, don't, look around what's out there. You will probably need a test framework, so have a look. You know, if you're in the Java world, there's JUnit, there's TestNG. Check it out, what fits the bill best. So definitely don't invent that. But there's also a lot of making company-specific frameworks, even to the point where you have a company-specific click, right? So the click method of Selenium is wrapped 50 times into some other stuff so that you have your company-specific click. There's no reason to do that, right? Selenium clicks. And if it doesn't, then there's probably something wrong with your application. And so you shouldn't try and build a framework around the fact that you cannot click. Yeah? So my advice is, and I totally see you do need a little bit of framework, but don't spend 2 years building a framework without writing a single test. Try to keep that in balance, right? Write a little bit of framework, just what you need, write a test, see if that's actually what you intended to do, and then keep growing the framework that way, which also ensures that you only build framework that you're actually going to use. Because I've seen frameworks out there, millions of lines of code, and maybe 5% of that code was actually really used. Yeah. So this is a big, or can be a big waste of time. But it's fun, right? So you don't need to do that. Utilize your test framework. So I'm just going to go through this real quick. It will save you lots of time. So something like this, for example. The difference between these two pages is that there's a little red, what is it called? Border, yeah. Little red border around that button. And what you can do is, so Selenium gives you this option to use an event-firing WebDriver, right? And so what you can do is actually put in these 2 lines of code and wire that with the event listener, right? And say, every time before you click on something, execute that piece of code, and that just happens to be this highlighting function. So every time in your test, you actually see that red border, right? Which is a much nicer visual than just seeing a page where you have no idea what happened. You can spend half a year doing this, right? Developing this, or you just use what Selenium and your test framework already provide to you. Run in parallel, right? So this is one of the things. Everything usually works out just fine when you run in sequence. As soon as you start running in parallel, it becomes a little bit more interesting. Your test framework supports that. in most cases, right? So here I'm using testng, and all I need to do in order to see what happens if I run this single test in parallel is actually I say invocation count 10, thread pool size 10. I click the button, and boom, I have 10 of those, right? And then I see if it's actually multi-threading able. Again, here, multi-browser right from the start. I'm assuming these slides will be distributed afterwards, so no need to memorize the code. I'm injecting desired capabilities via a data provider. That is a fundamental part of the testng framework. Yeah? I'm injecting the desired capabilities. So all I need is here, I have this test. I'm wiring it together with the data provider, and what happens that for every single desired capability that I have in here, testng will fire up a new test with that browser version, right? So I don't need to copy paste for every browser this piece of code. I can just wire it right here. Yeah. Now, Selenium doesn't come with any test case management and reporting capabilities. That is true. And that's because Selenium is just a library that automates browsers, remember? One of the first slides. But what it actually does quite nicely, it integrates with reporting frameworks. And one of my favorite reporting framework is actually Allure, right? And that comes from Yandex, I believe, right? Right, so same thing, I see companies spending an enormous amount of effort in building reporting frameworks, right? And it's still not quite so nice and shiny. And then we typically walk in and we're like, have you seen Allure or Extent, right? Or there's a few out there. And it's like, oh no, I had no idea, right? And this is really, one line of code, you add it and it's done. You don't have to worry about it. And it's supported by the community, right? You don't even have to spend money on it. Yeah. Good. Now, Selenium, this is I believe the last, or one of the last slides. So Selenium infrastructure is hard to maintain. Yes. Anybody has a different opinion on that? If you build your own Selenium grid, maintenance is simple? Selenite, yeah. I mean, there are frameworks out there or tool sets out there that help with that. But so there's typically two ways how you can go. So you can either use a commercial Selenium grid infrastructure, and so there's, as I mentioned before, there's the ones in the cloud, Browser Stack, Sauce Labs, right? Then there's the Selenium Box that we built, which is kind of what they do, just on premises, or you just build it on your own, and you're going to waste a lot of engineering horsepower doing that, right? So if you can, avoid building it yourself, right? I mean, building, again, is the fun part, but then once you need to maintain it, and once those new browsers keep releasing, and the new drivers, and when Simon makes his magic changes to Selenium, right, then usually you feel the pain of that, right? So if you can, avoid it. There are solutions out there that let you focus on what you're probably paid for, yeah? And also what we're seeing with a lot of companies out there who are trying to do this on their own, they don't assign the proper people resources to it, right? So somebody tries to do it in his spare time, and that typically means that the thing is completely not up to date, which then causes, again, these flaky tests, right? Because depending on which Selenium grid node you hit, that may have the right Chrome driver, etc., right? Your test passes or your test crashes, right? So make sure that your test infrastructure is 100% solid, so you can focus on the tests. So don't do it. Don't build infrastructure yourself. Good. So what's my point? A couple. So Selenium itself is not difficult. Everybody who has worked with it will probably agree with it. But you need to know how to code in order to make the most out of it. spend that time on your test framework. Read the code. When people, we sometimes help companies hiring, in hiring automation engineers, and then they ask us, so how should they ramp up? Usually I send them the link to either JUnit or to the TestNG documentation and say, read that. That's going to be the best return of your time. Know your test framework. Know what you can do with it so you don't need to reinvent all this stuff. Yeah? Learning the Selenium API is a piece of cake. Yeah? That's not where things become, or that's not where you get the biggest return of it. Your test framework. Take care of your test data. Yeah. So I know this is typically out of our hands, right? If you're a developer or a tester or whatever, the test data comes from somewhere, right? But if you have the ability to influence the people building the application, right? Make sure that they at least try to put mechanisms in place where you can create and manage and delete your test data. Yeah. When it comes to new tools, I mean, absolutely, check them out. But don't stop at the hello world example. Right? Just because that works, then it's also right for your entire company. And don't just listen to the loudest person in the room. Right? And don't build and maintain Selenium infrastructure. Yeah? There's other people who have done that for you, or who have done that. They figured it out. They've put in the hard work. You need to pay them for that, of course, but if you do it, you're going to pay a lot more, right? And last but not least, have fun doing all of this, right? I mean, whatever we do, we're in a very comfortable position, having chosen the professions that we chose, you know, that we can actually have a lot of fun with all of this. Contribute to open source projects. I mean, Selenium is only where it is at because of people like Simon, like David Burns, and many, many others, right, who have helped to get the project there. That goes for all the other open source projects as well, right? Don't just consume. I think this is, we were speaking about that last night. A lot of companies, all they do is they consume, but they don't even allow their employees to contribute back, right? So try, if you have a chance. Good. So thank you. I hope I copy-pasted the Russian version of that correctly. Thank you very much. I think we are pretty much, well, I guess we have 2 minutes.
Perfect time, yeah.
So if you have questions now, I guess we can...
We will go to discussion zone because we have just 1 minute. So thank you very much, Michael.
All right. Thank you.